The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
So just before starting with the next panel introduction and discussion, like I said, before lunch, we'll be stopping, taking a break at 3:20 just to do a reset for the Chief of Defence Staff, who will come in and have his observations and discussion with the conference. He will not be introduced at that time, as the good Dr. Nossal will be doing that as well. And then once that is done, we will have our closeout comments that are made, and then we will close the conference out around 4:30 p.m. this afternoon. So for this next discussion, we have, as I noted, Dr. Kim Nossal. He's an emeritus professor of political studies in the Center for Institutional and Defense Policy at Queen's University. Lots of research, lots of publications, but largely with a focus on Canadian foreign and defense policy. And he will be moderating the discussion today, for which we have an online speaker as well on strategies for the future. Sir, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Welcome back for this penultimate session. In the KCIS firmament, panel 6 is always the fun panel because we've spent 2 days looking at the different aspects of the topic under discussion this year. And panel 6 is always the panel where we get an opportunity to reflect on the policy implications and what the takeaways are for the topic. And in this year, of course, it's on the high Arctic. And to do that, we have 3 panelists today. We're going to take them in the order that they appear in the program. Dr. Thomas Hughes from the University of Manitoba, Professor Gunhild Hoogensen Gjørv from the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, and appearing online will be Stephanie Pezard of Iran Corporation. And all of our panelists are going to look at the implications and possible policy recommendations. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Thomas Hughes.
Thank you. Marvellous. Thank you very much indeed. It's a real privilege to be able to stand on the final panel and stand on the shoulders of the giants that have come before us over the last couple of days. And as Professor Nossal said, it's a brilliant topic, this one, I think. It's always good fun getting the crystal ball out, giving it a bit of a rub and discussing policy and how we think we're going to go forward, especially in an environment that's quite as rich and nuanced as the Arctic. But I think therein also lies the rub. And as I think we're all very much aware, making predictions is something of a poisoned chalice. There are a lot of directions that the Arctic could go in. And I'm also very much aware that there are an awful lot of very smart people in this room who've done an awful lot of thinking about what policies we could put in place in the Arctic. And you've all been reading even more ideas from even more people about what policies we could follow. The fact that I am lucky enough to be standing on this podium behind this microphone is insufficient in itself to indicate that I have the silver bullet solutions to this. So instead of giving some narrow policy prescriptions, I want to kind of draw on the last couple of days of conversation. I'm going to resist the temptation to add to the noise of policy. And instead, by stepping back, hopefully try to discuss policies, if you like, that are in fact what I see to be the key questions. And the key ways that we need to think about the challenges that are ahead in the Arctic. So I'll draw on some of the discussion from the past couple of days that's resonated with me in particular, as well as some of the principles that are sown through strategy and policy documents that I'm sure many of you are very much aware of, but have not yet, in my opinion, been fully brought into the Arctic context. So I'm going to start with a subject that is close to my heart. I get far too excited about threat perception and how we understand others' intent. We've heard a lot about domain awareness, and this is about domain awareness. It's just about awareness in that more nebulous domain of cognition, rather than the more tangible domains that we often discuss. So the 2019 Arctic and Northern Policy Framework basically tells us that we don't really understand what many other states are trying to do in the Arctic. And frankly, I'm not sure that's changed in the past 3 years. And that's a problem. Because if we don't understand what others' objectives are, it's really, really hard for us to make decisions on how we're going to move forward and achieve our own goals. So how do we start to understand those objectives? Well, there's one classic approach that we often take that I'm going to urge us a little bit of caution on. So far be it from me to argue with the Gospel according to St. Matthew and that classic line of, by their deeds ye shall know them. I think it's more accurate to say it's by your understanding of their deeds that you are going to know them. So in other words, it is tempting and it's really genuinely helpful to trace a pattern of activities. But we need to be really careful that we don't end up making lazy assumptions on the basis that because somebody did X, they have objective Y, or because they did X, their priority is Z. An example from us close to home, US 11th Division we've heard a little bit about. They've ramped up a lot of training in Alaska. Do we, going back to my question from this morning, really anticipate large-scale ground-based conflict in the North American Arctic? No, we don't. But I think it's quite easy to see how you could draw that direct connection if you didn't really understand the nuances of policymaking in our environment. The other challenge, I think, is that we are always tempted to counteract individual actions. And for the most part, I think that's okay. But we end up being constrained by some self-created cognitive boundaries, if you like. And I think it's really important that whilst we do continue to address individual actions that are problematic, we also think more holistically about the objectives that others are trying to achieve. Because by doing that, we have some more space, I think, for creativity. If we look at that bigger picture, we start to see how we can engage with the medium and long-term patterns of activity and shape them, rather than playing whack-a-mole with each new thing as it emerges on our horizon. And alongside that, as the point says on the screen, not all threats are perceived equally. Different objectives means that there are different understandings of threat and different prioritizations of threat. I think it's fair to say that most states in the Arctic have, at the highest political level, very broadly similar objectives, whether that's economic benefit, if that's improving defense and security and the like. But we know that the way in which that's manifested in practice and across actors is really very different. So the more prominent question that we need to ask is, what is the threat that is understood by each actor? As a simple example, we know that for Russia, Northern Sea route is a critical facet of their future economy. That means that they will have a different perspective of a key threat in the Arctic. And that means that they are going to have a different idea about what capability they need in order to mitigate that threat. And that is absolutely crucial when we talk about the CBMs that Dr. Greaves brought up yesterday. It's that key question, what is it that we actually want to build confidence in? How do our specific needs differ from other countries who are also acting in the Arctic? And how do we build a regime that actually incorporates potential different understandings of threat, rather than assuming a blanket concept that will apply equally to everyone? And I think this requires exploring the rationale for different action. We've got, for example, competing definitions and understandings of the best way to deter an adversary. Is it going to be those clear red lines with very obvious and understood responses to certain actions? Very transparent, that's the approach that I would suggest that we within NATO have taken over the past few years. Or do we show that little bit of crazy? Do we create that caution from the uncertainty because of our actions? The sort of approach to deterrence that it looks like North Korea and perhaps to a lesser extent Russia has attempted in recent years. Shellings dancing on the edge of the cliff. It's that approach that's very much focused on brinkmanship. And we could debate that ad infinitum, which one is going to be more effective. But the key point that we need to address here is how we understand how the other side is trying to deter us, what they are trying to deter us from doing, and how we are reacting to that. Because if there's a disconnect in approach to deterrence, then we can very quickly end up in a very awkward situation of an unanticipated escalation. And building on this, I think we have a significant challenge. We need to understand that our own expectations are also a product of our cognitive biases. What I think is really interesting in the Plan Domain Force Employment concept, which we'll come to a little bit later, is this idea that every action we take is a message, even if we don't think it is going to be. It's going to be taken as such. And strategic messaging is therefore absolutely vital. So, first big question, how do we manage our strategic messaging? And this isn't just for the armed forces. This is about how the CAF can align with other agencies. Are we actually talking to allies about our messaging and fitting it alongside theirs? We've got the NATO Stratcom Centre for Excellence, but in my opinion, I think we could plug Canada into that a little bit more effectively. Or, in other words, we give Captain French a lot more money than he's already getting. So the central understanding here, though, is what message are we sending? And it's not just what message do we think we are sending, but what message is being received, and importantly, do they match? We hear that a few times, but I think even more importantly, even if the message is received as we wanted it to be and expected it to be, is it having the effect on policy and action that we also expected it and wanted it to? Again, close to home as a simple example, even within an alliance. The standard line on so many of the documentation around NATO exercises is that we run an exercise with NATO partners, and that signals joint commitment to the alliance, and everyone's one big happy family. Do we know that that's actually the case? Has anyone sat down and thought, is this actually causing that relationship to grow? And even more importantly, what's the tangible outcome from that? How are we measuring that? With adversaries in particular, that's a really, really difficult process. We can't sugarcoat it, especially in the medium term. It requires an awful lot of patience and an awful lot of acceptance of an awful lot of uncertainty, but it is necessary. So that messaging, I think, is crucial. Both the intended and unintended messages will shape how we understand and how others understand a threat environment. And particularly given the seemingly unfortunate low likelihood of us being able to engage with Russia in a formal institutional context in the near future, actually getting that signaling right is really important on both sides. We also need to be really honest about our own capabilities. I think as we've heard through the conversation, it's not unfair to say that Canada's kind of in the short blanket position. We can either cover our feet or we cover our shoulders, but we probably can't do both at the same time. So there's lots of missions that I think we would like to be able to undertake, but we can't do all of them at the same time. That's okay. It's not unusual. Every country does this, and it's the old cliche about everything being a priority, and nothing is being a priority. However, we have to be honest about what missions we actually can do. And part of this is about signaling as well. We need to show that we're not bluffing. There's little point in overstating what we're capable of doing when potential adversaries are aware, at least in broad brushstrokes, about what our capabilities are. It just undermines the rest of our messaging. We also need to have a conversation and critical self-reflection about what constitutes adequate security for us. Dr. Sharon and I were having a conversation a few weeks ago about whether Canada would be comfortable with more US aircraft in Canadian airspace taking a bigger chunk of responsibility for Canadian air defence. If so, that for sure gives Canada more operational flexibility, but it also suggests that Canada is not fully reliant on itself for its security. So in the Arctic, what do we need in order to be confident in our own security? In this context, how do we think about confidence in terms of can we counteract aggression from a particular opponent versus confidence in our ability to determine the intent of others on either the short or the medium term? In both cases, confidence is a sliding scale. You can be strongly confident, less strongly confident. But that also means we need to understand what level of confidence we actually need in order to feel secure. The pan-domain force employment concept is great. I really like this document. Whether or not it becomes doctrine, I think it raises a lot of points that are useful when we think about the Arctic. As has been noted by a lot of people so far, that one of the core concepts, I think, from the pan-domain force employment concept is the connection of different levers of national power. We've already got some good examples of this, the MSOC PRTs that were mentioned yesterday, but I think it would be wrong to say that they have been optimized so far. So rather than thinking about how we link those individual silos of capability, we need to have a much more holistic conversation about how we fuse CAF capabilities with those of allies and those of non-military partners as well. And this also links back to signalling. The potential for dual-use infrastructure, I think, is interesting. New runways in northern Canada with appropriate engagement with the local population is a great example of how we can have more holistic benefit from potentially ostensibly CAF-focused action. But here I think I would urge a little bit, well, maybe not caution, but urge a little bit of reflection. Very often when we discuss dual use from other states, we see it as kind of subterfuge or something that's a little bit aggressive. We very rarely seem to see that part of the conversation when we talk about building dual-use infrastructure. So the question for us, I think, is how do we align that genuine practical benefit of dual-use infrastructure with whatever signal it is that we want to send? And if we're serious about pan-domain approaches to operations, what does that mean for CAF engagement with civilian agencies, especially around areas of responsibility, around information sharing, and around legal frameworks? I'm very much aware that PDO isn't just a whole-of-government approach, but that need to engage with other agencies is a really prominent part of that document. And that needs to be carefully thought through in the Arctic context, given the significance of the Arctic for Canada. So finally, on sort of the main points, how do we choose the right policy option? Well, I mean, obviously, we never know whether we chose the right policy option until the outcome has occurred. And counterfactuals are fun but hard. But nevertheless, I think we need to think about how we come to the decisions that we are taking. The Canadian Forces Operational Planning Process 2008 is a thrilling and gripping read. And I think it's genuinely good about how we use information. But I don't think it talks sufficiently about how we moderate the inputs to that process. So again, this needs some soul searching about our position and the lenses that we use. We've seen with the GBA Plus process that we can do this, but what are the assumptions that we hold about the Arctic? And I think the comments that we heard yesterday from a few speakers around the need to question our assumptions and biases are very much worth doubling down on. Secondly, have we actually thought holistically about the steps that we need to take to achieve that political objective? Back to the pan-domain concept. So the OPP tells us, and I quote, "The operational art requires the ability to visualize the synergistic effects of all available capabilities in the achievement of the strategic goal." I told you it was thrilling, didn't I? So, in each circumstances, what capabilities are actually available in order for us to be able to achieve our broader goals? And again, we need to avoid the parochialism and silos that unfortunately characterize a lot of the decision-making that we end up going through. We have to develop that mutual understanding. So we need to work backwards from a clear objective. We can't hide behind, well, the government hasn't given us a clear objective. That may be true, but we need to then make sure that appropriate pressure is being put on those decision makers to ensure that we create those objectives that we can start to work towards. So to conclude this, the prompt for the panel suggested that speakers will discuss strategies and present implications of Arctic activity. But I think in that there is a hint that we are waiting passively to see what the outcomes of our actions are going to be. And I don't think that's particularly helpful. We know that we are going to be buffeted by circumstance, whether it's climate change or actions from adversaries that we simply can't fully prevent. But it is incumbent on us to shape the context and create the framework in which those implications are going to play out. In doing so, we create an environment that is just that bit more predictable. To do that, we need to be creative, understand whether or not we are asking ourselves the right questions. Are we achieving the intended and actual effects of the actions across multiple time horizons? And it's only by questioning those assumptions and foundations that we can optimize policy. I really love KCIS. I think it's fantastic. It's one of the best forums in Canada, if not North America and beyond, at bringing great people together from a range of backgrounds and creating a real springboard for moving policy forward. But who isn't here? How can we expand this discussion? What insights have we not been hearing that can help us develop our Arctic capabilities? And what that means for all of us is that this conversation cannot stop when we check out of the Holiday Inn and go back to our day jobs. If we don't, and we fail to take the lessons from today, if we fail to take them to other decision makers, if we fail to think about what we've heard and actually translate that into action, and the 2 days that we've had have been very interesting, they've been enjoyable, enlightening, illuminating, and absolutely bloody useless. Dr. von Hacke, CIDP, US Army War College, et al., Maureen in particular, and the team do a fantastic job again, I think, over the last 2 days of setting brilliant foundations about thinking about implications for the High North. But it's then our responsibility to ask the so what and ensure that all of the brilliant ideas that we've heard actually get translated into meaningful action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Professor Hoogensen Gjørv.
Thanks. I'll just repeat what Thomas said. No, I'll want to carry on from what you said, but definitely want to repeat what you said to thank you to the organizers of this conference, and very much thank you for inviting me. And of course, in the last panel, I demonstrated that I need to know more about the softs, and we'll work on that. But there's a reason why I was picking on you guys, wherever you guys are here. There, yes, there's a reason. Because I'm really interested in where you're working, not just the specific localities, but also the bigger picture around it and the complexities around that picture. And so what I want to do is I'm going to get into the civilian domain, because we've been talking about a lot of sort of military strategy and particularly strategy. And periodically we have talked about communities, but I'm also I want to take a look at this in sort of a little bit of a bigger picture with that too. I stole this from that table. No one's sitting there, so they're not going to care. But I thought it was a really interesting picture because it reminded me of thousands of years ago when I was doing my, I don't know, master's or bachelor's. No, hold on. PhD. But I remember that, I think it was around in the 80s, that Oren Young, he was writing about the Arctic. He was very interested. He is a political scientist, for those who may not know, was writing about the Arctic. And he was talking about descriptions that were given in the Arctic at that time. Pristine and desolate were two words that just sort of stuck in my head. Because and this picture kind of, I mean, although, yes, geographically we get that, but it has an emptiness about it. And these words, pristine and desolate, also have given an emptiness. And there are still people who have that impression about the Arctic, that it is this, I'm just going to dump this, that it is this sort of space where not a hell of a lot is happening. And actually, this conference has definitely demonstrated that this is an incredibly complex region. As has been pointed out, I mean, across this enormous space is 4 million people, of which it's also been pointed out roughly 1/4 of those people are Indigenous peoples, and the rest, obviously, non-Indigenous peoples. spread over, as Will pointed out, over vastly different regions. We can't talk about the Arctic as the Arctic, really, because we've got the Euro-Arctic or European Arctic, we have the North American Arctic, and we have, of course, the Eurasian Arctic, Russia, for the most part, where most of that territory is lying. So it's a very diverse space. There are multiple languages across this particular region. It's also a region that's very rich in natural resources. And what was it, like the big thing in 2008, wasn't it? What the hell was that guy's name? Who was talking about, it's a race for the resources, right? And that used to be part of the dialogue, or was the dominant debate, is that actually what the Arctic is all about is just like trying to grab the resources that are in the Arctic. There was the estimation about how much oil and gas are still located within the Arctic, so this was the big thing. That's still a part of the picture, and that much we see also today, given the energy crisis that we're finding ourselves in, and where energy and going back to oil and gas, and I think our keynote speaker was saying, well, in fact, with all the efforts of going to renewables, that and shutting down a lot of other options with regards to energy, there's even the talk about going back to coal. So here we have a region that is very much in the center of this energy crisis as well. It is also, and as has been pointed out, it's a region that is subjected to the effects of climate change. And the last sort of estimation I've seen is that it's happening 3 times faster in the Arctic than it is in other parts of the world. So we have this very dynamic region. Of course, there's the 8 states within these different, different regions of the Arctic. There's climate change. There's the energy question, and all the other resources that are in the Arctic, and not least now conflict, as has been also been pointed out. So I'm doing like a summary here from the whole conference, but as has been also pointed out, 7 of the 8 states of the Arctic Council are on the way to be NATO members, which also changes the dynamics happening in this particular region. We have in Europe, if at the end of the day that Sweden and Finland will become NATO members, and I'm not giving this sort of like the fait accompli until we're for sure through those goalposts, as we saw there was some negotiating that's still needed doing. But nevertheless, so then in the European side of the Arctic, we have what one can refer to as a northern fortress now. It's not just the little border that Norway has with Russia anymore that is the northern flank and NATO's flank up until Russia, the northern flank, but now we will have then all of Finland. And then you have Finland, Sweden, and Norway on that part. And then, of course, Denmark over to the left or right. So you have this northern fortress. That also will change the dynamics of both how these countries operate together, potentials for interoperability. There was, of course, cooperation from before, but now those dynamics will change even more. And up against a Russia that has been using Mearsheimer's argument to say that, it's all NATO's fault, it's all the West's fault, and the U.S., so U.S., West, and NATO are conflated to be the same. So this is what the Arctic is, and it's an incredibly complex space with a lot of shit going on. So we do need to pay attention to what's happening in the Arctic, because a lot of the tensions will also not only be just waiting for what's happening in more southern climes, but also be very dominant in this particular region. And not just that. Now, one thing, to come back to the climate change, that's probably one of the most, I was going to say interesting, but interesting not in a good way, factors that will impact conflict as well, in the sense that over the longer period, if we continue in a position of conflict, which it seems like it will be between NATO states and Russia, that climate change will also exacerbate part of that conflict dynamic. And so we have to take on board what's happening with climate change, and we have to take on board mitigating climate change as part of our conflict mitigating strategy. But that's just touching on the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of how complex the Arctic really is. This thing here, it also has been characterized in a way in a very static form, and Will was talking about this as well yesterday, as this sort of zone of peace, and encapsulated by this notion of Arctic exceptionalism. And Arctic exceptionalism has been this narrative about, you know, this is a place where nobody wants to have conflict, and we just have it very, very peaceful. And I have found that concept problematic because of the fact that security perceptions are dynamic. They are not static. The security perceptions of Russia today are not the same as they were articulated in the early 1990s, nor towards even under Putin, even though we can roll back now and look at speeches and go, ooh, he was kind of hinting at this kind of stuff. But nevertheless, there was a different perception in Russia operating at the time within that particular regime about Russia's security perceptions. And so these are dynamic. And our security perceptions, or our on the way NATO Western side, are also a dynamic security perceptions. So rather than looking at this as sort of a static Arctic exceptionalism, which is actually a really problematic concept to be using as a lens to understand the Arctic, I find having a comprehensive security approach to the Arctic is, for me anyways, far more useful because it helps us understand these particular dynamics. And what I mean is not only the dynamics as security perceptions change between states, that over time, but also at different levels. Because it's not just state security we need to be concerned about, but we need to be understanding perceptions of security around the environment, around energy, societal security, and not least human and or individual security. And I'll explain also why I separate those as well. Security then is, if one wants to get right down to the basics, and now, you know, it's good to end a conference with like Political Science 101 or something. But I mean, I like to go back to the basics about what security is about, because actually if we understand security as a multiplicity of actors, so it's not just states, but they're different actors. And we've seen that happening, not just in the Arctic context, but in other contexts around the world, where non-state actors as well as state actors are relevant, but also values. Values play such a huge role in security. And I will come back to this as well, because this is incredibly important, I think, as we are thinking about the future for the Arctic, but also globally. The practices about how to maintain those values and thinking about those practices and whether those practices work or actually do maintain these particular values, because our interest is that security is about the values that we wish to see survive into the future. And those would be sort of like our top priority values. And often these are articulated as freedom and democracy, human rights, those sorts of things. Or that's even been articulated at quite often at NATO. NATO is standing for these particular values. I was at NATO last week. Those were the values that were articulated. Well, how are we protecting these? What are the practices that are embedded here? And how do these link up to our understanding of security? One thing that's also been mentioned here, or one of the many things that's been mentioned here, is also the nature of conflict, because I think this is also going to be impacting the Arctic very much. And I will get back to what I mean by values and everything from security. But the gray zone and hybrid threats moving into hybrid warfare, as we see in Ukraine. And the gray zone is that under threshold space that is more and more targeted as a space to disrupt societies. And I think this is an area that's fascinated me, because if we take a look at take sort of a rough definition of the gray zone or of hybrid threats, and I do a lot of work with the Hybrid Center of Excellence in Helsinki. And so if we just take a look at even a rough definition of hybrid threats in warfare and the different phases, the priming phase, where there are attempts to sort of find out what are the weaknesses in a society. So it's not about a tank rolling over a border, but it's actually finding out what makes us tick. The destabilization phase is using the stuff that seems to land, that seems to make us tick. And what I mean by making us tick is provoking us, that we're getting, we're reacting to things and would polarize people, would set opinions against each other. So all of this is happening in the civilian domain. We've been talking about domains in a variety of contexts. But my focus is the civilian domain because I'm really curious about the ways in which the civilian domain is playing a role in the success or failures of mitigating conflict. And conflict which is either under threshold or even over that threshold and entering into sort of full-scale type of war. In this gray zone then is such a large area of the civilian space where there needs to be also civilian responses. And that means that there needs to be a tighter cooperation, not necessarily dominance by the military side, but a cooperation between the civilian and military elements and actors in a space to understand what is happening across the whole spectrum of this type of conflict. So that's the part that really interests me, is the way in which these sorts of interactions are taking place. I can give as an example, in the Nordic countries, you already see this kind of interaction taking place as a defense mechanism through the concept of total defense. And total defense, and I'll sort of default to the Norwegian approach, but is where you have cooperation and tight collaboration between the military, the defense forces, and multiple civilian authorities and agencies. And this is something that is worked on and trained upon so that there's a coordinated effort based on the understanding that a conflict, a crisis or a conflict, now when I say crisis is when it doesn't feel so warlike perhaps, but that in these sorts of crises or conflicts, that it's acknowledged that it's not just a military solution. And then in fact, a lot of the solution lies in the civilian domain. And hybrid warfare then is also challenging that, and it's challenging the civilian space. So the sort of work that I've been looking at is, well, what happens in the civilian space? We have these different civilian authorities, agencies and such, and you might be able to have coordination between these authorities, but also within that space are actual civilians, people who are acting and reacting, and based on their own perceptions of security, will do X, Y, or Z under a situation of crisis or conflict. So, for example, let's say the electricity is going out. It's completely cut out. It could be due to cyber attack, or it could be just something idiotic has happened on the electrical nets, the energy net. But nevertheless, the energy has gone. The electricity has gone out, and that means we have no heating. We don't have any internet. That is making an impact on our abilities to have to share communication. We'll also throw the mobile net or the cellular net out as well. So, and these are things we're talking about in Norway. Is this, well, what if everything just gets cut out? And what are people going to be doing? And how do people know what they should be doing? Or do they assume what they're doing? Are they prepared for this? A few years ago, we sent out, like in 2018, we sent a brochure to all households in Norway. And I was like, you are a part of Norway's preparation. We didn't want to mention the word war because I was a little dodgy. The Swedes, however, sent out a brochure the same year, what to do during crisis or war. So they're ready to just say this could be a war. But in any case, we wrote something down, or the Directorate for Civilian Preparedness. Sorry, I'm doing the translation in my head, so it's not coming out very well. But this organization was one of the primary organizations in Norway with regards to the civilian response, was talking about that, okay, all of us normal average civilians are to have 3 days worth of provisions to be able to, come through a crisis. Well, that sounds very good. But what happens after 3 days? On day 4, back to Netflix and chill? Or, but the likelihood is that that's not the case. The likelihood is that a crisis could go on longer. And that sort of crisis, whatever the start is of that crisis, it can also be used to try to exacerbate even more conflict and try to find where are the weaknesses, who is afraid under this crisis, who is now thinking, well, I'm not going to stay here. I know there's better provisions in a different part of Norway, and I'm going to get on the road and I'm going to drive there. Well, our roads, particularly in the north, in the Arctic, suck. So they're not, at least, we shouldn't complain, because in Canada, there are no roads, as we've found out. But we do have roads, but they're very, very narrow. They look like back alleys by Canadian standards. And it's, if you had a traffic jam on there, how is that dealt with? How do people respond to that? And so even just testing these sort of like thought experiments about how people will react under a crisis, and not just waiting passively to be rescued by all of these authorities, but are actually actors in the crisis. And in particular, we know that they're actors in a crisis because this is where these hybrid threats are actually very influential and coming into play, and are working to erode trust and resilience of a community. And if it's already low trust in a community, and it's even more easy to set in doubt and mistrust against authorities or even against other people within the community. And we see this happening, actually, with regards to the use of disinformation. And I was, like I say, I was at NATO last week, and I was talking about the civilian domain as an important part of the battle space. And we're not talking about the use of weapons as in, a gun or whatnot, but it's just fascinating the way that information is deployed to try to polarize people, towards aggressive attitudes towards each other, and not towards each other or towards their particular governments. Okay, I have to wrap up. I have to shut up. The point being is that a lot of what's being targeted in society is actually the things that are already existing in society today. And it's not that, for example, you could have a disinformation about the Finnish prime minister who was dancing, and that this caused her much problems, and she was targeted. It was said that she was targeted, and it made her look bad, and all that kind of stuff. But it was meant to be using her as an example of poor leadership that comes from women, and trying to reduce trust in female leadership and as women and running the Finnish government, which there's many women doing so. In fact, elements about our own society, our own prejudices, our hatreds towards each other or towards a government are in fact used and deployed towards or using minorities, women, other types of vulnerable groups to try to target those who are already distrusting certain groups in society and trying to polarize them. So these are just some of the aspects, a very short brief into the aspects of how society is actually playing a role in either exacerbating or mitigating conflict, and having to do with the trust that we have in society and our abilities to deal with crisis and conflict and not go and attack each other. The keynote speaker yesterday was talking about how he had a good trust in, well, in this case it was Canadian people, and he was talking about how, I think it was Martha and Henry would, be really keen on coming up with solutions. We just put our politics away and we'll come up with sort of solutions. And it could be that Martha and Henry are keen on having some sort of solutions, and inclusive solutions that bring everybody on board. But it's also possible that Bob and Nancy don't give a shit. And it's the Bob and Nancys we're also interested in, because if there's a critical mass of people who may be against Martha and Henry, or against the people that Martha and Henry are interested in preserving the rights for, human rights, civil rights and such, this can cause a great polarization in society. So it's these aspects of hybrid warfare that I think are actually going to be quite pervasive in the Arctic context. And because it's so tense and polarized within, just between like NATO states up against Russia, I suspect that in the Arctic, we need to be very much prepared for under-threshold, an increase in the under-threshold threats that are, of course, cyber attacks, but exacerbated and happening at the same time as disinformation and as economic attempts to try to bring people, buy people off and such. And what I mean is like China working in the Arctic and trying to say, well, you know, we'll pay for this if your governments aren't going to pay for this. So all of these things combine together into the hybrid threats with the interest of pulling the civilian population apart. And it is this aspect that I think is also an important part of the strategy to mitigate conflict in the Arctic. So.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Gunhild. And now, Dr. Pezard. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your invitation. I really wish I could be present with you today in person. I would be much happier in Ontario than in rainy Maryland. But I'm glad that technology allows us to do this and to have me with this brilliant panel. Thank you, Thomas and Gunhild, for thought-provoking remarks. So, as Thomas mentioned, this is a very daunting panel. The future of the Arctic, so many directions to go, so few chances of being accurate in the end. So my approach is actually not gonna try to look at the future of everything in all of the Arctic, but I'm gonna focus on the future of one non-Arctic state in the Arctic, and that is China. So the new US national security strategy that just came out expresses concern about China's intentions and capacity to reshape the international order. But at the same time, specifically about the Arctic, in its Arctic section, it also states that the PRC has sought to increase its influence in the Arctic by rapidly increasing its Arctic investments, pursuing new scientific activities, and using these scientific engagements to conduct dual-use research with intelligence or military applications. At the same time, the strategy also leaves the door open for cooperation with China on global issues such as climate change and public health. So today I will talk more specifically about what potential risk could China's activities pose to the Arctic and what strategies by the US, Canada, and other Arctic states might mitigate these risks. And my points here are based on a study recently published that I co-led with my RAND colleague Steve Flanagan in collaboration with FOI in Sweden. We each examined China's activities in the Arctic with a focus on the North American Arctic and Greenland for RAND and a focus on the European and Russian Arctic for the FOI team. So looking directly in what a future Arctic might look like, what we did in the course of that research was to design a tabletop exercise to understand the pathways through which China could become a prominent Arctic player, and also get a better understanding of which of these pathways could potentially upset the current regional-based order. So we had 20 participants and 8 observers, all from, they were Arctic and China experts from academia, think tanks, government, and industry. And we built a scenario that was set in 2035 that described China as thriving politically, economically, socially, culturally, and militarily in the Arctic. So basically, we built that dream state, the dream situation for China in 2035, where it's achieved all of its objectives in the Arctic and beyond, and is highly influential in the region. And the purpose of the game, of the exercise, was to ask participants what needed to happen or could happen between 2022 and 2035 to get to that situation. Either events that were initiated by China or events that were absolutely not in their control, but that somehow they would benefit from, such as economic recession, an ecological disaster, really any sort of event or trend that could lead to that situation. So that was a sort of interesting exercise of imagination that brought us a few interesting takeaways. The participants thought that China has limited levers overall in the Arctic. First, because Arctic nations are reluctant to give it more space. China is not that popular with Arctic indigenous populations. And also China can be its own worst enemy, as demonstrated by some abrasive aspects of the so-called warrior diplomacy, and the downside of some of its large-scale infrastructure projects elsewhere. Not that there's many of these in the Arctic, actually, except in the Russian Arctic. But this could change if China showed added value for the region, for instance, by providing some capital that is needed or by providing some critical technology. There are also, it could also change if there were some strong incentives for China to push its way through. So for instance, if there was a massive increase in commodity prices, because right now China is not a #1 Chinese priority. The Arctic is not. So, the US and Russia will play a key role in China's future presence in the Arctic. Obviously, there is the question of a potential even closer Russia-China relationship that was deemed possible, again, by the participants of this tabletop exercise. If they gain traction jointly in challenging the current international system, or also there were two situations that were sort of the two extremes, but could also be potentially problematic. One case was Russia being more weaker than it is today and needing China more than it does today. Or the other extreme was Russia being much stronger than today and not fearing China anymore and not being the sort of obstacle to a larger Chinese involvement in the Arctic that it's been so far. And a last takeaway from that little exercise was that China seems more likely to use its economic rather than military power in the Arctic. The PLA, Coast Guard, and fishing fleet are not Arctic capable currently, and may need more than a decade to refine its capabilities. And our participants also didn't really see clear benefits from a military presence versus the really clear gains that they gain from an economic presence. And that economic presence in turn benefits from stability. So overall, looking at how the Arctic could evolve in the future, there are some strong sort of factors of resilience in the Arctic that will prevent, or will likely prevent, a stronger Chinese presence in the Arctic, will prevent also the risk of a questioning by China of the current regional order and Arctic governance. These factors of resilience, none of them are permanent though. So this is not saying that none of them are cast in stone and all have, again, events, trends that could change them. One is the fact that China has difficult bilateral relations with several Arctic countries. The relationship with Canada, and I'm not going to go again, into some developments that have been covered by some other speakers. But in the North American Arctic, which again is what we've been looking at, the relationship with the US, the relationship with Canada is difficult, and with Greenland, Greenland is really the only of the three where there is more opening, but here again it's limited. Also, Arctic states have historically agreed to keep Arctic matters among Arctic states, which also limits the forays that China can do diplomatically and in terms of pushing a different governance system. Looking at some issues with, again, some economic activities in other regions of the world, it seems that in the Arctic, local laws and local populations can prevent activities that could create environmental damage. That's something that we've seen particularly in Greenland, where domestic politics have been influenced by the positioning of various politicians with regard to natural resource extraction and the risk, the secondary effects of some of these enterprises, particularly with uranium extraction. Arctic states also have regulations that prevent large or suspicious Chinese activities. The US and Canada has very strong FDI regulations. Greenland is actually working on its own regulations with the help of Canada, so it's getting stronger here too. We also see that most Arctic states are allies and partners and act in solidarity. As Gunhild reminded us, we're talking about soon 7 out of 8 Arctic states potentially being NATO members and consulting each other frequently on many issues. Also, another factor of resilience is simply put the high cost of investment in the Arctic that still limits the region's attractivity. This is a factor that's going to change over time, but is still important today. We also see that Arctic nations' level of technological development limits China's appeal. It's not like China can provide technologies that Arctic nations do not have, and that's also something that sets the Arctic as a region apart from other regions of the world. And similarly, the Arctic nations' relative wealth protects them from predatory lending practices that, again, we can see in other regions of the world. So these factors either prevent Chinese investments that could have some of the negative impact that we see in, for instance, BRI investments, Belt and Road Initiative investments, prevent them from happening or can mitigate negative impacts. But like I said, none of these factors is necessarily gonna stay there forever. So, for instance, we see right now some Arctic solidarity, but who knows if, for instance, the Arctic Council could not become fragmented over engagement with Russia or with China. So we have strong investments on screening and regulations in the Arctic, but who knows if regulations could become relaxed in the context, for instance, of a major economic downturn or an increased need for investment. And also a number of these factors are simply not within the control of the US and its allies or partners. For instance, the high cost of investment, the high level of technology, or the high level of wealth are outside of their control. And I would add a few areas of uncertainty that also we still need to watch for. One is Russia's relationship with China, as already mentioned. There is a risk of a closer cooperation with increased sanctions against Russia, and maybe more aligned interest between the two. And eventually, continued Russian isolation could lead China to seek a separate path to realize its Arctic goals. There's also uncertainty related to Greenland's independence. And also, over time, simply opportunities for investment, not just from China, but from others as well, will grow. Access is getting easier. As we know, technology will follow. And the last point is that China may also realize that it's often its own worst enemy in the Arctic. So the wolf warrior diplomacy does not play well in the Arctic, but at the same time, China has shown an ability to step back when needed. And China could simply deliver on its promises to improve the common good in the Arctic through investments, progress, technology sharing in search and rescue, environment, just maybe some technologies meant to mitigate the consequences of climate change, such as carbon capture. All of these could make China a sort of contributor that is sought after. So what does that mean for what Arctic nations can do, the US, Canada, their allies and partners? So one thing is to maintain solidarity among US allies and partners in the Arctic. This seems to be sort of the strongest point, and we see it also in the new White House strategy on the Arctic. And by the way, that this study came out before the White House Arctic strategy. A second point would be exploring conditions and possible pathways for restoring some level of engagement with Russia on Arctic issues. This would have immediate safety benefits for the US and its allies, and might also help convince Russia that it gains from status quo in the Arctic. The new Arctic strategy, again, White House Arctic strategy, states that US-Russia cooperation in the Arctic is, I quote, virtually impossible at present, but also notes that in the long term, it may be possible for some cooperation to resume under certain conditions. A third point is to maintain active engagement, particularly with Greenland, to promote mutual interest and sustainable economic development. And again, sustainable economic development is a very, very important theme of the new Arctic strategy. Continue to elevate engagement in the Arctic, which the Arctic strategy does by itself. And the last point is to work more closely with indigenous populations who are both key to both influence and legitimacy. So we could build, for instance, the US could, for instance, build on existing cooperation between the Department of Defense and the Alaska Federation of Natives, also could leverage Arctic Council's permanent participants and engage them more comprehensively and more meaningfully. So these are just a few ideas, and I look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Our panelists have given us some considerable thoughts for our concluding discussion. We've got about 15 minutes or so, and so let me throw it open to questions or comments. Yes.
Hi there, Kenneth Hammond from the Royal Military College of Canada. I just have a question for Dr. Hughes. You mentioned that we need to be honest with ourselves about our capability, and unfortunately in Canada we've seen a bit of a speed bump in that. We have delayed procurement projects, and a bunch of our current capabilities are rendered insufficient in what we need them to do. And you also mentioned potentially outsourcing capabilities to other nations, and the example I'd like to point to in particular is with the United Kingdom last year offering to help us with our Arctic security concerns, particularly in use of their nuclear submarines. My question to you is, especially given the current security environment with Russia, do you believe that we are honestly at a point now where we need to seriously consider bringing in allies to our territory to help us with what we need to do?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So I think, are we at a point where we need allies? I think the consistent line from Canada has always been that we act in conjunction with allies. So I think that's the first point to make in there. I think that is always going to be part of Canada's approach. The second answer to that question, again, as I hinted at in the presentation, or at least tried to, I think we need to have a clear understanding of different forms of threats. And I would expect and imagine that there are certain forms of threats for which Canada will be reliant on allies, and there will be others that it is okay to run on itself, whether that's because the threat in itself can be countered or whether the likelihood of the threat is seen as so low. So I think we need to be a little bit more granular in how we approach that. And again, it really comes back to that point of honesty around what is it we can do, what is it we're actually worried about, and how do we improve the former in order to mitigate the latter.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
My question's for Dr. Gjørv. So, you're talking about hybrid warfare stuff, and I think we're kind of speaking the same language on that from that perspective. My presentation, we were discussing kind of the Clausewitzian negative war aim of, hey, I'm trying to build resilience and stop somebody else from accomplishing their objectives. In my other hat, on the other side, I am the hybrid warfare guy for the United States doing that to adversaries, right? And so I think being able in training and working on doing that to an adversary gives you perspective on potentially shoring up defenses for yourself as well. So I think we got a lot of common ground there. My question to you is, how do you manage military involvement in civilian governance tasks to counter hybrid threats while trying to manage perceptions that Dr. Hughes was talking about?
Good question, but I think my default there is to say that it's not so much the military need to manage the threats, that actually we need to increase civilian capacity to also address those threats. So that there needs to be situational awareness, obviously, within the military system amongst those who are both interacting intimately with, say, a given community, but also those who are seeing the broader picture, but also that the response has to be civilian in nature, particularly for a lot of the under threshold type of threats. So it's that kind of interaction. And I think it's a different kind of interaction, or the assumptions are a little bit different than perhaps maybe where there's an assumption that when it's a crisis, if not a conflict, that the military are the ones who are in the forefront, standing, taking the particular lead. So here is a situation where we need to think about how are the civilian communities actually equipped to deal with hybrid threats. So here maybe this is where your empowering possibilities could come in, because you know also how to deploy some of these things. So you would have that capacity to say, hey, you know what you need to look out for is X, Y, and Z, and so forth. But a lot of these things are inevitably going to be outside of even your purview. You may be able to help them on the ground, or perhaps they're not, because I don't know everything that you do. But I think about the fact, the ways in which some like disinformation campaigns can be used. And we've been talking about infrastructure, for example, in the north, and how, and it seems to be across the Arctic. There is this problem about the fact that there isn't enough investment in infrastructure, and there needs to be more, and for the communities to be resilient. And this also goes into the role of trust, because when communities realize that they are supported by their governments and get the infrastructure they need, that also can foster trust. But here's where disinformation can play a fun little role in splitting north and south against each other, because when the majority of the populations are in the south, and this comes back to, Bob and Nancy, that I mentioned, doesn't give a shit. If you have enough of those who are powerful enough within, their constituencies, and are also not interested, because we were talking about it earlier, you need, in this case, the Canadian population to be on board in investing in the north. Well, what if you have a critical mass that are not invested in that? What if they're just looking at the Arctic as that blob that really doesn't need any sort of attention? And these sorts of and they can also be very much built on discrimination, on negative perceptions about peoples in the north, which exist not just in Canada, across a lot of these states. So there's a very interesting process that we need to look at. We need to look at what's happening in the community in question. So there's where empowering those communities and helping their resilience, but also looking at the broader picture, what else is affecting the ability to support resilience and to try to build up trust, because less trust can also lead to much polarization and a fracturing of people and a willingness to even mitigate the conflict. How's that?
One final question.
Okay. Going on about the civilian side of it, I'm going to talk to you what happened in Cape Breton 2 weeks ago with Fiona. I witnessed the hurricane coming through Cape Breton, being working for the government. Nobody was allowed to leave out their house except people who work for government with chainsaw to go and cut trees, because there was no electricity anywhere. Now, what I witnessed is 5 days after no electricity, there were fist fights at gas station. I witnessed a knife attack at a gas station. I also witnessed jerry can being stolen from people's property, because what happened is the gas, we missed fuel, and people had generators. So what happened is there was a frenzy of trying to get fuel. So this is just an example of 2 weeks ago what happened after Fiona. Now let's transpose this to the up north. And then they're in the same situation, no electricity, no gas, no nothing. So what would be a policy, or what would be a resilient thing that can be done? Because we were helpless until the military showed up. I'm not kidding you. Sending 100 military guys helped us incredibly well. So thank you guys for CAF, because you helped us. But now this is what I'm saying about up north. Like, what can we do?
Thank you. Do you want a quick response?
I don't know, send CAF, send the SOFs, send our 2 majors. I mean, obviously, these go on multiple levels, and this is why interaction between both different agencies, both military and civilian, but also having the populations more aware of actually what can happen under a crisis, because I have 3 citizenships, and one of them is Canadian, hence the accent. So the thing is, I remember not learning anything about crisis other than, okay, I was around during the Cold War, parts of it, the end. But nevertheless, I was fearful about a nuclear bomb, but I mean, shit, there wasn't anything you could do about that. It was game over. But otherwise, sort of preparedness. And in Norway, we don't talk about it enough. Well, now we're starting to talk about it because we actually tried to get this on the airwaves. But it's really, it's something we need to have more conversations about, so that people themselves are not going to first think about stealing a jerry can, but maybe there are other solutions. But we need to have those conversations.
Thank you. And on that, it remains for me to ask you to thank the panelists for their contributions today. Thank you.
So just prior to handing them their gifts of thanks, there's a change to the schedule. The CDS will now be speaking at 3:20, so just in about, just over 5 minutes, my apologies. So if I could just ask for a quick change in place here while we bring the CDS in for that 10-minute advance to the schedule. Thank you very much. And gifts with thank you. Thanks.